Combat, combat, combat. All of the so-called Dark Age games, from Heroes to Unleashed or Black Knight, suffer more than we think because of their combat. You could argue it's because of gimmicks, but most often the gimmicks manifest themselves in combat. Almost always the critics label or denounce the combat as boring or tedious. But as I'll show you, more often than not, there are several complex layers beneath the combat. If we start by looking at Heroes, you have multi-health enemies, you have the whole level up system, you have the team mechanic in terms of, in part, T-Blast, which does damage to a lot of enemies, and in part, chaining together your teammates' different abilities to take out certain enemies. While the task to take down multi-health enemies with like 20 health might seem tedious, you have to remember that in part there is the level up system, which allows you to take down enemies faster if you do well on the stage and gather enough level up orbs, or if you just use your teammates in the right way. For example, when you homing attack, you can make your partners also join in on the homing attack to triple the damage on each homing attack, thus cutting down the combat time by an entire third. Shadow and Black Knight have the whole combat while on the rails type gameplay going on. Shadow has the gun gameplay, whereas Black Knight has the whole sword mechanic. Both games are criticized for having this heavy emphasis on combat instead of platforming level design. While Shadow does have more platforming than Black Knight, I'm not sure I can vouch for its gunplay. But when it comes to Black Knight, which has less platforming, I can actually vouch for its swordplay and the combat. The timing is so important there. Some people just think, oh, it's just waggle, waggle, waggle. But no, in actuality, try to 5-star some missions and you'll see just how much timing goes into each strike. The closer you are to your enemies when you do slash, the wider your attack range becomes and the more running momentum you preserve after the slash. There's also always the option to do a short jump and slash, but people just default to the homing attack buzzsaw because of how OP it is. But a lot of the time you just don't need it. You can time normal attacks better, as well as the shorter jump slashes and get by levels with 5 stars without having any hiccups in your speed. I used to think the game was sort of shallow and just good for short bursts of fun, but after I realized the depth of the combat, the game became insanely more replayable. And if you want to realize this yourself, I suggest trying to 5-star the target missions in Misty Lake. Now, since I've already covered Black Knight, the last Dark Age game that remains is
No worries! Avoiding things is what I do best!
Unleashed. And well, Unleashed is pretty famous for having its Werehog, which dissenters denounce for being tedious and boring. And of course, on the first run, the Werehog does take up most of the game, which critics use to say, oh, if 2/3 of the game is bad, then the game is bad. And since the Werehog does consist mostly of the combat, even more than its platforming, if you do spend all of your time in the combats mindlessly button mashing, of course the game is going to be bad. But, just like Heroes and Black Knight, there is skill in the combat. There are tons of combos and moves which chain spectacularly into each other. And a lot of the more advanced moves take out more enemies and faster. You know how good it feels to do a Shohog Ken into a Hurricane combo and then cancelling that into a Power Drive, damaging everyone in the vicinity. There's so much fun to be had if you just pay attention to the more advanced combos and the depth, rather than just brute forcing your way through with mindless combos. And that really is my main point of this entire video, which is that a lot of times, looking at Heroes, looking at Black Knight, looking at this game, the combat does have layers to it, but Sonic Team has just allowed people to brute force their way through the combat in the most mindless of ways. So I urge you to please explore the depth of the combat within each of these games, and you'll find yourself having so much more fun in no time.
The Warhog is still a bad ripoff of Sonic the Fighters.